Mum, honestly, you're just too old for this kind of adventure. Why don't you stay home and rest while we tackle Mount Harrison? It's going to be a real challenge, and we don't want you holding us back or getting hurt. Those were the exact words my daughter Jessica spoke to me over the phone last Tuesday evening, her voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise over the past few years. The sting of her words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could have. Here I was, at 63 years old, being dismissed by my own child as if I were some fragile piece of china ready to shatter at the slightest touch. I sat there in my kitchen, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles had gone white, listening to her continue her monologue about how the family hiking trip to Mount Harrison was really more suitable for the younger generation. She went on to explain how my son Robert had agreed with her assessment and how they'd already made arrangements for the weekend without including me in any of the planning. The casual way she delivered this news, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to exclude their mother from a family activity, left me speechless for several long moments. "We'll take lots of pictures for you, Mum," Jessica added, as if that would somehow make up for being left behind. "You can see everything we saw when we get back. Maybe we can even make you a nice photo album." The condescension dripping from her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't concern for my well-being. This was them viewing me as a burden, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a family member to be included. After I hung up that phone, I sat in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The kitchen clock ticked away the seconds while I processed what had just happened. My own children, the people I had raised, sacrificed for, and supported through every challenge life had thrown at them, had just relegated me to the sidelines of my own family. They hadn't asked about my fitness level, my experience, or my desire to participate. They had simply decided, without any input from me, that I was too old, too weak, too much of a liability to join them on what was supposed to be a family adventure. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not the explosive, shouting kind of anger, but the cold, calculating fury that comes from being deeply wronged by people you trust. Jessica and Robert had no idea what they were talking about. They saw a 63-year-old woman and immediately assumed I was past my prime, ready for the rocking chair and afternoon naps. They had no clue about the life I'd lived, the challenges I'd overcome, or the strength I still possessed. What made their dismissal even more insulting was the fact that neither of them had any real hiking experience themselves. Jessica worked in marketing and spent most of her time behind a desk, occasionally going to the gym, but never pushing herself beyond her comfort zone. Robert was a software engineer who considered a walk around the neighborhood to be exercise. Yet somehow, they had appointed themselves the experts on who was capable of handling a mountain hiking trail and who wasn't. I thought back to all the times I had supported them, encouraged them, and never once suggested they were incapable of achieving something they set their minds to. When Jessica wanted to run her first 5K 3 years ago, despite having no running experience whatsoever, I was there at the finish line cheering her on. When Robert decided to take up rock climbing at 35, despite his fear of heights, I drove him to the climbing gym every week until he got his confidence up. I had always been their biggest cheerleader, believing in their abilities even when they doubted themselves. But now, when it came to a simple hiking trip, they couldn't extend me the same courtesy. They couldn't even give me the chance to prove myself or make my own decision about whether I was up for the challenge. They had made that decision for me, and the message was crystal clear. I was old, I was weak, and I was no longer welcome in their adventures. The family dynamics that had led to this moment hadn't developed overnight. Over the past couple of years, I'd noticed a subtle shift in how my children treated me. It started with small things, offering to carry my groceries when I was perfectly capable of handling them myself, suggesting I shouldn't drive at night, even though my vision was fine, recommending I hire someone to help with yard work that I'd been doing myself for decades. Each incident by itself seemed like loving concern, but taken together, they painted a picture of two adult children who had decided their mother was entering her decline and needed to be managed accordingly. I had tried to address this pattern before, but my concerns were always brushed off with phrases like, "We just worry about you," or "We want to make sure you're safe." They made it sound so reasonable, so caring, that I began to question whether I was being too sensitive. Maybe they really were just looking out for my best interests. Maybe I should be grateful to have children who cared so much about my well-being. But this hiking incident had torn away the gentle veneer of their concern and revealed what was really underneath. They saw me as a liability, someone to be protected and managed rather than included and respected. They had decided I was too old to be a full participant in family activities, and they felt completely justified in making that decision without consulting me. The history of my relationship with outdoor activities would have surprised my children if they had bothered to ask. Back in my 20s and 30s, before marriage and motherhood consumed every waking moment of my life, I had been quite the adventurer. I spent weekends rock climbing in the local state parks, took solo camping trips that lasted for days, and once even completed a 3-day backpacking expedition through the Appalachian Trail section that ran through our state. I wasn't some sedentary housewife who had never stepped foot on a hiking trail. I was someone who had temporarily set aside her love of outdoor adventure to focus on raising a family. Even during the busy years of child rearing, I had tried to maintain my connection to nature and physical fitness. I took Jessica and Robert on countless nature walks when they were young, teaching them to identify different types of trees, birds, and wildflowers. We went on family camping trips every summer, where I was the one who set up the tents, built the campfires, and navigated the trails. I was the parent who encouraged them to climb trees, explore creek beds, and push their physical boundaries in safe but challenging ways. After my husband passed away 5 years ago, I had actually increased my physical activity as a way of coping with the grief and loneliness. I joined a hiking club for women over 50, started taking yoga classes 3 times a week, and began strength training with a personal trainer who specialized in working with older adults. My doctor had repeatedly praised my fitness level at annual checkups, noting that I had the cardiovascular health of someone 20 years younger and the bone density of a woman in her 40s. But somehow, none of this information had penetrated the narrative my children had constructed about me. In their minds, I had transformed from their capable, adventurous mother into a fragile, elderly woman who needed protection from the world. They saw grey hair and assumed frailty. They noted that I was in my 60s and concluded that my active years were behind me. They had created a version of me that fit their expectations of what a 63-year-old woman should be, rather than seeing who I actually was. The Mount Harrison trip had originally been my idea. 3 months earlier, I had mentioned to Jessica during one of our weekly phone calls that I'd seen beautiful pictures of the mountain online and thought it would make a wonderful family outing. She had seemed enthusiastic at the time, saying she'd talked to Robert about planning something. I had assumed that when she said family outing, she meant all of us together. I never imagined that they would take my suggestion and turn it into an adults-only adventure that excluded the person who had proposed it in the first place. Over the following weeks, I had heard bits and pieces of their planning through casual mentions in our conversations. Jessica had bought new hiking boots and was researching the best trail routes. Robert had purchased a high-end backpack and was studying topographical maps of the area. They were clearly taking the expedition seriously and putting considerable effort into their preparations. What hurt most was that they were doing all of this planning without ever asking for my input, despite the fact that I probably had more actual hiking experience than both of them combined. I began to realize that this wasn't really about Mount Harrison at all. This was about my children's perception of me and their need to protect me from experiences they deemed too challenging or dangerous for someone my age. They had appointed themselves as the arbiters of what was appropriate for me to do, and they felt completely comfortable making decisions about my life without consulting me. The hiking trip was just the most recent and visible example of a pattern that had been building for months. The conversation with Jessica had taken place on a Tuesday, and they were planning to leave for their hiking adventure the following Saturday morning. That gave me 4 days to figure out how I was going to respond to this situation. I could simply accept their decision, stay home, and wait for them to return with their photos and stories. I could express my disappointment and hope they would change their minds, though based on Jessica's tone during our phone call, that seemed unlikely. Or I could find a way to demonstrate that their assumptions about my capabilities were completely wrong. As I sat there in my kitchen that Tuesday evening, staring at the phone I had just hung up, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and disappointment were still there, but they were being joined by something else, a fierce determination to prove my children wrong. They thought I was too old, too weak, too much of a liability to handle a hiking trail. They were about to learn just how mistaken they were. I walked over to my laptop and opened up the website for Mount Harrison State Park. I studied the trail maps, read the difficulty ratings, and checked the weather forecast for the upcoming weekend. The main trail to the summit was rated as moderate difficulty, with an elevation gain of about 2,800 feet over a distance of 4.2 miles. It was challenging, but definitely within my capabilities, especially considering the training I'd been doing with my hiking club over the past several months. The more I researched, the more confident I became in my ability to not just complete the hike, but to do it better than my children probably would. I knew from experience how to pace myself on steep climbs, how to conserve energy for the return trip, and how to read weather conditions and terrain. I understood the importance of proper hydration, appropriate gear, and safety precautions. Most importantly, I had the mental toughness that comes from years of pushing through physical challenges and not giving up when things get difficult. My children, on the other hand, were approaching this as a fun weekend adventure with no real understanding of what they were getting themselves into. They had the enthusiasm of beginners, but lacked the experience and knowledge that comes from years of actual hiking. They were probably planning to power through the ascent as quickly as possible, take some selfies at the summit, and then struggle their way back down with sore muscles and aching feet. That night, I lay awake formulating a plan that would send a message my children would never forget. I wasn't going to argue with them or try to change their minds about including me in their trip. Instead, I was going to show them exactly what this supposedly frail, elderly woman was capable of accomplishing on her own. If they thought Mount Harrison was too challenging for me, I would tackle it solo and prove them spectacularly wrong. Wednesday morning, I called the ranger station at Mount Harrison State Park to get detailed information about trail conditions, permit requirements, and safety recommendations for solo hikers. The ranger I spoke with was incredibly helpful and seemed impressed rather than concerned when I mentioned my age and hiking experience. He recommended starting the hike very early in the morning to avoid afternoon thunderstorms that were common in the area during this time of year, and suggested I register with the park office so they would know to expect me back by a certain time. I spent Wednesday afternoon gathering and checking all my gear. I pulled out my well-worn hiking boots, the ones I'd purchased 15 years ago and had broken in on dozens of trails throughout the region. I packed my day pack with all the essentials: extra layers of clothing, first aid supplies, navigation tools, emergency whistle, headlamp, extra batteries, high-energy snacks, and plenty of water. Every item had a purpose and had been tested on previous hiking adventures. Thursday, I drove out to Mount Harrison to familiarize myself with the trailhead location and parking situation. I wanted to eliminate any variables that might slow me down or cause problems on the day of my actual hike. The drive took about 90 minutes from my house, which meant I would need to leave home around 4:30 a.m. to reach the trailhead by 6 a.m. and start hiking at first light. The early start would also ensure that I would be well on my way up the mountain before my children even arrived at what was probably going to be a much later starting time. I studied the trail markers and read the information posted at the trailhead, taking photos with my phone so I could review the route details at home. The trail was well marked and appeared to be in good condition, with recent maintenance evident in the cleared brush and repaired wooden bridges over creek crossings. Weather conditions for Saturday were predicted to be ideal. Cool morning temperatures, warming to the mid-70s by afternoon, with clear skies and minimal wind. Friday evening, I received a text message from Robert that made my blood boil all over again. "Hi, Mom. We're all set for our big adventure tomorrow. Don't wait up for us. We probably won't be back until late Sunday since we're planning to camp Saturday night and do some exploring on Sunday morning. Hope you have a nice relaxing weekend at home." The casual dismissiveness of his message, combined with the assumption that I would be sitting at home waiting for them to return, reinforced my determination to go through with my plan. I set my alarm for 4 a.m. and went to bed early, though I was so energized by anticipation that it took me quite a while to fall asleep. In my mind, I kept visualizing the hike ahead, the steady climb through the forest, the gradual thinning of trees as I gained elevation, the final push to the rocky summit, and the moment when I would take that triumphant photo with the mountain vista spread out behind me. I could already imagine the expressions on my children's faces when they saw the evidence of what their too-old mother had accomplished. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, with stars still visible in the pre-dawn darkness as I loaded my gear into the car. I felt a mixture of nervous excitement and grim satisfaction as I drove through the empty streets toward the highway. By the time my children were probably just waking up and thinking about breakfast, I would already be several miles up the mountain trail. The drive to Mount Harrison passed quickly, filled with classic rock music on the radio and the gradual lightening of the eastern horizon. I arrived at the trailhead parking lot exactly on schedule and was pleased to see that I was the first hiker of the day. The solitude felt perfect. This was going to be a solo accomplishment, achieved through my own strength and determination, with no one else to witness or validate the experience except myself. I took a few minutes to do some light stretching and adjust my gear one final time, then signed in at the trail register and officially began my hike at 6:15 a.m. The first section of trail wound gently upward through a dense forest of oak and maple trees, with occasional glimpses of the mountain peak visible through breaks in the canopy. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birds beginning their daily routines and the soft rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. My pace felt comfortable and sustainable, fast enough to make good progress, but controlled enough to conserve energy for the more challenging sections ahead. This was the rhythm I had developed through years of hiking experience. Start conservatively, find your natural cadence, and trust your body to maintain that pace for the duration of the climb. It was a completely different approach from what I suspected my children would attempt, which would probably involve starting too fast and burning themselves out before reaching the halfway point. As I climbed higher, the forest gradually began to change character. The hardwood trees gave way to conifers, and the air became noticeably thinner and cooler. The trail became rockier and steeper, requiring more careful foot placement and occasional use of my hands for balance on scrambling sections. This was the kind of terrain that separated experienced hikers from weekend warriors, and I felt completely at home navigating the challenges. About 2 hours into the hike, I encountered my first fellow hiker of the day, a young man in his 20s who was descending the trail at a rapid pace. He looked surprised to see me and stopped to ask if I was okay and whether I needed any assistance. I thanked him for his concern, but assured him that I was doing fine and was experienced with this type of hiking. His surprised expression when I told him I was heading for the summit made me wonder what assumptions he had made about my capabilities based on my appearance. The encounter with the young hiker reminded me of all the times over the past few years when strangers had made assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based solely on my age and appearance. There was the grocery store clerk, who insisted on carrying my bags to the car despite my protests that I was perfectly capable of handling them myself. There was the parking lot attendant, who warned me to be careful, walking across a perfectly normal asphalt surface as if I might trip and fall at any moment. There were the countless instances of people speaking to me more slowly and loudly than necessary, as if advancing age automatically meant hearing loss or cognitive decline. But what hurt most were the similar assumptions coming from my own family. My children had absorbed society's stereotypes about aging and applied them to me without ever stopping to consider whether those stereotypes matched the reality of who I was or what I was capable of doing. They saw a 63-year-old woman and immediately jumped to conclusions about frailty, limitation, and the need for protection from life's challenges. As I continued climbing, I thought about all the ways I had tried to maintain my independence and vitality in the years since my husband's death. I had deliberately chosen to stay in our family home rather than moving to a retirement community, despite subtle pressure from both children to downsize to something more manageable. I had kept up with home maintenance projects, continued driving myself wherever I needed to go, traveled solo to visit friends in other states, and maintained an active social calendar filled with activities I enjoyed. None of that seemed to matter to Jessica and Robert. They had decided I was entering a phase of life that required their management and oversight, and they felt entitled to make decisions about what was best for me without consulting me or respecting my own assessment of my capabilities. The hiking trip exclusion was just the most visible manifestation of an attitude that had been building for months. By 9:30 a.m., I had reached the final approach to the summit, a steep, rocky section that required scrambling over boulders and navigating some exposed ledges. This was definitely the most challenging part of the entire hike, and I could understand why it might intimidate inexperienced hikers. But I had dealt with similar terrain many times before, and I felt confident in my ability to handle it safely and efficiently. I took my time on this section, carefully planning each move and testing each hand and foothold before committing my weight to it. The key to scrambling safely is patience and deliberate movement rather than speed and athletic prowess. I had learned this lesson years ago during my rock climbing days, and it served me well now as I worked my way up the final 100 feet to the summit. At exactly 10:15 a.m., I stepped onto the rocky platform that marked the highest point of Mount Harrison. The view was absolutely spectacular, a 360-degree panorama of rolling hills, distant mountains, and valleys filled with morning mist that was just beginning to burn off under the strengthening sun. I could see for miles in every direction, with hiking trails, roads, and small towns visible as tiny features in the vast landscape spread out below me. I spent several minutes just absorbing the achievement and the beauty of the moment. I had successfully completed a challenging hike that my own children had deemed too difficult and dangerous for someone my age. I felt strong, capable, and incredibly proud of what I had accomplished. This wasn't just about proving a point to Jessica and Robert. This was about proving something important to myself. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, including one of myself with the summit marker and mountain vista in the background. This was the image that would tell the whole story, evidence that their too-old mother had not only completed the hike they thought was beyond her capabilities, but had done it solo and with a smile on her face. I made sure the timestamp was clearly visible in the photo properties so there could be no doubt about when and where it was taken. The descent proved to be more challenging than the ascent in some ways, as hiking downhill puts different stresses on muscles and joints and requires careful attention to foot placement to avoid slips and falls. But I had expected this and paced myself accordingly, taking frequent breaks to rest my knees and ensure I maintained good form throughout the return journey. I encountered several other hikers on the way down, including a group of college-aged students who were struggling with the steep sections and seemed amazed that I was navigating the same terrain with confidence and ease. One of them asked how long I had been hiking, and when I mentioned that I'd been doing this type of activity for over 40 years, their respect was evident. It felt good to be seen as an experienced outdoors woman, rather than as someone who needed protection from physical challenges. By 1:30 p.m., I was back at the trailhead parking lot, feeling tired but exhilarated. The entire round trip had taken just over 7 hours, including time spent at the summit, taking photos and enjoying the views. It was a respectable time for that particular trail, especially for a solo hiker who had prioritized safety and enjoyment over speed. I drove home with a sense of satisfaction and anticipation. I had the proof I needed to make my point to Jessica and Robert, and I was curious to see how they would react when they realized what their supposedly frail mother had accomplished, while they were probably still working their way up the mountain at a much slower pace. I arrived home around 3 p.m., showered off the trail dust, and uploaded my photos to my computer so I could review them properly. The summit photo had turned out perfectly, clear evidence of my successful climb, with the timestamp showing that I had reached the top of Mount Harrison at 10:15 a.m. I wondered what time my children were planning to start their hike, and whether they had even left home yet. Based on their usual weekend routines, they were probably just finishing a leisurely brunch and thinking about getting their gear together. The photos showed me looking happy, healthy, and triumphant, with the vast mountain landscape stretching out behind me. My hiking gear was clearly visible, demonstrating that this wasn't some casual walk, but a serious outdoor adventure requiring proper preparation and equipment. Most importantly, I looked like what I was, an experienced hiker who belonged on that mountain and had every right to be there. I spent some time selecting the best image and crafting the message that would accompany it. I wanted to strike the right tone, not angry or accusatory, but clear and unmistakable in its implications. After several drafts, I settled on something simple and direct. Beautiful morning for a hike. Thanks for the suggestion to try Mount Harrison. The views from the summit were absolutely worth the climb. Hope you're enjoying your weekend adventure too. At 4 p.m., I sent the photo and message to both Jessica and Robert via text message. Then I sat back and waited to see how they would respond. I imagined them looking at their phones, trying to process what they were seeing, and slowly realizing that their mother had not only completed the same hike they were attempting, but had done it earlier in the day, and apparently with less difficulty than they were experiencing. The first response came from Jessica about 30 minutes later. "Mum, is this really you? When did you take this?" Her message was followed immediately by a phone call that I chose not to answer. I could hear the confusion and concern in her voicemail message. "Mum, please call me back. We need to talk about this photo. I'm worried about you hiking alone like this. Please call me as soon as you get this message." Robert's response took a bit longer to arrive, but it was more direct. "Mum, what the hell? You went hiking by yourself without telling anyone? Do you have any idea how dangerous that could have been? We're really upset and worried about you right now. Please call us immediately." I found their reactions fascinating and somewhat predictable. Rather than being impressed by my accomplishment or acknowledging that they had been wrong about my capabilities, they were focusing on their worry and their perception that I had done something reckless. They couldn't seem to grasp that I had successfully completed a challenging hike without incident, demonstrating exactly the kind of competence and preparation they claimed I lacked. Over the next hour, I received several more texts and voicemails from both children, each one expressing increasing levels of concern and frustration. They wanted to know why I hadn't told them about my plans, how I had managed to complete the hike so quickly, whether I had been hiking with a group, and whether I was okay. The irony was thick. They had excluded me from their family hiking trip because they thought I couldn't handle it, and now they were upset that I had proven them wrong. I decided to let them stew for a while before responding. Part of me wanted to call them back immediately and explain exactly why I had felt compelled to make this solo trip. But another part of me felt they deserved to experience some of the uncertainty and worry they had caused me. They had made a unilateral decision about my capabilities without consulting me. Now they could deal with the consequences of discovering they had been completely wrong. Around 6 p.m., I finally called Jessica back. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with stress and irritation. "Mum, where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours. We're really worried and upset about this whole situation." I calmly explained that I had been home resting after my successful hike, and that I was perfectly fine and hadn't seen any need to rush into a conversation about what was, from my perspective, a perfectly normal outdoor activity. "But Mum, you went hiking alone without telling anyone. What if something had happened to you? What if you had gotten hurt or lost?" Jessica's voice was rising with each question, and I could hear the genuine fear behind her anger. I reminded her that I had been hiking solo for decades, that I always followed proper safety protocols, and that I had registered with the park service so they knew to expect me back at a specific time. "That's not the point," she insisted. "The point is that you're not as young as you used to be, and hiking alone isn't safe for someone your age. You should have told us what you were planning, so we could have gone with you, or at least known where you were." I found it remarkable that even in the face of clear evidence that I had successfully completed the exact same hike they were attempting, she was still focused on my age and supposed limitations rather than my demonstrated competence. I asked her how their own hiking experience was going, and there was a long pause before she admitted that they had started later than planned and were finding the trail more challenging than expected. Robert had developed blisters within the first hour and was having trouble with the steep sections. They had turned back before reaching the summit and were planning to try again the next day with a different approach. The irony was not lost on me. The people who had deemed me too old and weak for the trail were the ones who had failed to complete it, while I had successfully reached the summit hours earlier. "Mum, that's not the point," Jessica said again when I mentioned this observation. "The point is that we were worried about you, and you didn't consider how your actions would affect us." I found this statement particularly galling, given that they hadn't considered how their actions in excluding me from the original trip had affected me. They seemed to believe that their worry about me was more important than my desire to participate in family activities or maintain my independence. The conversation with Jessica continued for another 20 minutes, during which she expressed frustration, concern, and what sounded like genuine bewilderment at my actions. She seemed unable to understand why I would feel compelled to hike Mount Harrison alone instead of simply accepting their decision that I wasn't capable of joining their family trip. In her mind, she and Robert had made a reasonable decision to protect me from a potentially dangerous situation, and I had responded by deliberately putting myself in exactly the kind of danger they had been trying to prevent. I tried to explain that their exclusion from the hiking trip wasn't really about hiking at all. It was about their fundamental attitude toward me and their assumption that they knew what was best for me better than I knew myself. I told her that being dismissed as too old, without any consideration of my actual abilities, experience, or desires, had been deeply hurtful and disrespectful. I pointed out that I had more hiking experience than both of them combined, and that their concerns about my safety seemed to be based on stereotypes about age, rather than any realistic assessment of my capabilities. But, Mom, we were just trying to look out for you, Jessica protested. We love you, and we don't want anything bad to happen to you. Can't you understand that we were coming from a place of caring? I acknowledged that their intentions might have been good, but I explained that good intentions didn't excuse the impact of their actions. Being excluded from family activities because of assumptions about my limitations felt like being pushed aside and marginalized, regardless of whether that was their intent. I also pointed out that if they were truly concerned about my safety, they could have asked about my hiking experience, discussed the specific challenges of the Mount Harrison Trail, or suggested ways to modify the trip to accommodate any concerns they might have had. Instead, they had simply decided I was too old and excluded me entirely, without any input from me about my own assessment of my abilities or my willingness to take on the challenge. The conversation ended without any real resolution. Jessica said she needed to talk to Robert about the situation and that they would probably want to have a family meeting to discuss what had happened. I told her I was open to that conversation, but that it needed to include acknowledgement of how their original decision had affected me, not just focus on their concerns about my solo hiking trip. Over the next several days, I received follow-up calls from both children. Robert was more direct in expressing his anger about what he saw as my reckless behavior, while Jessica continued to focus on their worry and concern. Neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge that my successful completion of the hike demonstrated that their original assessment of my capabilities had been wrong. They remained focused on the fact that I had hiked alone without informing them, which they saw as dangerous and inconsiderate. What struck me most about these conversations was how they revealed the depth of their paternalistic attitude toward me. They seemed to genuinely believe that their worry about me gave them the right to make decisions about my activities, and that I should have consulted them before undertaking a challenging hike. They had appointed themselves as guardians of my safety and well-being, without any recognition that I was a competent adult who had been making my own decisions about risk and adventure for over 6 decades. I began to realize that the hiking incident was just a symptom of a much larger issue in our family dynamics. My children had transitioned from seeing me as their capable, independent mother to viewing me as someone who needed their protection and oversight. They had made this transition without consulting me or considering whether I agreed with their assessment of my changing needs. They were treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted to make appropriate decisions about my own life. The family meeting Jessica had mentioned finally took place the following Sunday, with both children coming to my house for what they described as a serious conversation about the situation. I prepared for this meeting by organizing my thoughts and deciding what points I most wanted to communicate. I wasn't interested in defending my decision to hike Mount Harrison alone. That decision had been vindicated by the successful outcome. Instead, I wanted to address the underlying attitudes and assumptions that had led to the original exclusion. Jessica and Robert arrived together, and I could tell from their expressions that they had discussed their approach to the conversation beforehand. They sat on my couch with serious faces, while I took my usual chair across from them. The formal atmosphere felt strange and uncomfortable, as if we were having a business meeting rather than a family discussion about hurt feelings and misunderstandings. Robert started the conversation by reiterating their concern about my solo hiking trip and their belief that I should have informed them of my plans before undertaking what they considered a dangerous activity. He emphasized that they loved me and were worried about me, and that my failure to consider their feelings before making my decision had been hurtful and inconsiderate. Jessica nodded along with his points, occasionally adding her own emphasis to particular concerns. I listened to their presentation without interrupting, but I could feel my frustration building as they continued to focus on their worry rather than addressing the original issue that had prompted my solo hike. When they finished, I asked them a simple question. Do you understand why I felt compelled to hike Mount Harrison alone? The question seemed to catch them off guard, and they exchanged glances before Jessica responded that they assumed I had wanted to prove some kind of point. But they didn't understand why that point was more important than their legitimate concerns about my safety. I took a deep breath and began to explain exactly why their exclusion from the hiking trip had been so painful, and why I had felt the need to demonstrate my capabilities. I told them that being dismissed as too old, without any consideration of my actual abilities or experience, had made me feel invisible and diminished. I explained that I had been hiking for over 40 years, that I maintained an active fitness routine, and that I had more experience with outdoor activities than both of them combined. But Mom, Jessica interrupted, we weren't trying to hurt your feelings. We were just being realistic about the challenges of the trail and the risks involved. I asked her what specific risks she was referring to and what information she had used to assess my ability to handle those risks. She admitted that she hadn't really researched the trail details or considered my actual fitness level. She had simply assumed that someone my age shouldn't attempt a challenging hike. This admission opened the door for a more honest conversation about their assumptions and attitudes. I asked them whether they had ever seen me fail to complete a physical challenge or struggle with activities that were within my normal range of abilities. They acknowledged that I had always been active and capable, but insisted that things change as you get older, and that they were just trying to be cautious. I pointed out that while things do indeed change with age, those changes are individual and varied, and that chronological age alone is not a reliable predictor of physical capability. I reminded them of my regular hiking club activities, my yoga classes, and my strength training routine. I showed them my most recent medical checkup results, which included praise from my doctor for my excellent fitness level and overall health. I asked them what evidence they had that I was declining or becoming less capable of handling physical challenges. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering not just the hiking incident, but the broader pattern of assumptions and protective behaviors that had been building over the past couple of years. I gave them specific examples of times when they had treated me as if I were fragile or incapable, and I explained how those incidents had made me feel patronized and diminished. I told them that I understood their desire to look out for my well-being, but that their approach was actually undermining my independence and self-confidence. Gradually, I could see that my points were beginning to resonate with them. Robert was the first to acknowledge that perhaps they had been making assumptions without really considering my perspective or capabilities. He admitted that when he thought about it objectively, he couldn't point to any specific incident or evidence that suggested I was becoming less capable of handling physical challenges. His concerns had been based more on general ideas about aging than on any realistic assessment of my individual situation. Jessica took longer to come around, but eventually she too began to see how their protective instincts had crossed the line into paternalistic control. She said she had never thought about how it would feel to be excluded from family activities based on assumptions about age and capability. She admitted that if someone had made similar assumptions about her abilities without consulting her or considering her experience, she would have been angry and hurt too. The breakthrough moment came when I asked them both a direct question. If I had been a 63-year-old man with the same fitness level, hiking experience, and medical clearance from my doctor, would you have excluded me from the Mount Harrison trip? There was a long silence as they considered this question, and I could see the realization dawning on their faces that gender stereotypes had probably played a role in their assumptions, along with age-based prejudices. Probably not, Robert finally admitted. I think we would have assumed that a man your age with your experience could handle the hike. Jessica nodded in agreement, looking uncomfortable as she processed the implications of this admission. They were beginning to understand that their concerns hadn't been based on objective assessment of my capabilities, but on unconscious biases about age, gender, and what was appropriate for their mother to attempt. We talked about how those biases had affected not just the hiking decision, but other interactions over the past couple of years. I gave them examples of times when they had offered unwanted assistance or made suggestions that implied I was becoming less capable, and I helped them understand how those seemingly helpful gestures had actually felt patronizing and dismissive. They began to see the pattern of behavior that had culminated in the hiking exclusion. By the end of our conversation, both children had apologized for their original decision and acknowledged that they should have included me in the planning for the Mount Harrison trip, rather than making assumptions about my capabilities. Jessica said she was impressed by my successful solo hike and admitted that she now realized she had underestimated both my physical abilities and my knowledge of outdoor safety. Robert expressed regret for the way they had communicated their decision and acknowledged that their approach had been disrespectful and hurtful. More importantly, we established some ground rules for future interactions. They agreed to consult with me before making decisions that affected my activities or assumed limitations on my capabilities. I agreed to keep them informed about my adventure plans, not because I needed their permission, but because I understood their desire to know I was safe. We also agreed that if they had genuine safety concerns about any of my activities, they would express those concerns directly and specifically, rather than making blanket assumptions about what was appropriate for someone my age. The family dynamics didn't change overnight, but the hiking incident and the conversation that followed it marked a turning point in how we related to each other. Over the following months, I noticed that Jessica and Robert began treating me more like the capable, independent adult I had always been, rather than like someone who needed their protection from life's challenges. They still expressed concern when I undertook new adventures, but they framed their concerns as questions about my preparation and safety precautions, rather than assumptions about my inability to handle the challenges. 6 months later, we finally took that family hiking trip to Mount Harrison together. It was Jessica's suggestion, and she specifically asked if I would be willing to lead the group since I had the most experience with that particular trail. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The supposedly too old mother was now being asked to guide her younger, less experienced children up the same mountain they had once deemed too challenging for her. The group hike was actually more difficult than my solo trip had been, because I had to adjust my pace to accommodate Robert's fitness level and Jessica's inexperience with steep terrain. But it was also more rewarding in many ways, because we were sharing the adventure as a family and building new memories together. At the summit, we took photos of all three of us together, and I couldn't help but smile as I remembered the solo photo I had sent them months earlier that had started this entire journey of understanding. Looking back on the whole experience now, I realize that the hiking incident taught me something important about standing up for myself and refusing to accept other people's limitations on my life, even when those people are family members who claim to have my best interests at heart. Sometimes the people who love us most can hurt us most deeply by trying to protect us from challenges we're perfectly capable of handling. Sometimes we have to prove our capabilities in dramatic ways before others will see us as we truly are, rather than as they assume us to be. I also learned that age discrimination can be subtle and well-intentioned, coming from people who genuinely care about us, but who have absorbed society's stereotypes about what older people can and can't do. Fighting that discrimination requires not just words, but actions, concrete demonstrations of capability that force others to confront their assumptions and biases. The mountain summit photo still sits framed on my kitchen counter, not as a reminder of conflict with my children, but as a symbol of my refusal to be diminished or sidelined by other people's expectations. It reminds me daily that I am the ultimate authority on what I can and cannot do, and that age is just a number that doesn't define my capabilities or limit my adventures. My children learned something important too, that their mother is still the strong, capable woman who raised them, and that treating her with respect means trusting her to make her own decisions about her life and her adventures. They learned that love doesn't give you the right to control another person, even when that person is your parent, and even when your intentions are good. Now, 2 years later, our family adventures include everyone who wants to participate, regardless of age. We make decisions together, we plan together, and we support each other's goals and challenges rather than making assumptions about who can handle what. The respect flows both ways. I consult with them about my plans not because I need permission, but because we're family and we care about each other's well-being. And I'm still hiking, still pushing my boundaries, still proving that 65 years old is just the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of an active life. The mountains are still calling, and I'm still answering with strong legs, a prepared mind, and the hard-earned confidence that comes from refusing to accept anyone else's definition of what I'm capable of accomplishing.